You may ever watched a tank rumble past and felt nothing but noise and weight. Romania's armored war carried something else. That is improvisation, risk, and a constant sense of being outpaced. Romanian units fought inside vehicles pulled from different worlds, altered under pressure, and thrown into battles they were never meant to dominate. They were machines meant to hold lines, delay disaster, and keep crews alive one more day. And today, we look at every Romanian Deadliest tank used in World War II, while showing you how they fought, where they stood, and why they're often overlooked. So let's start with R2. You know what makes the R2 unsettling? On the day Romania ordered it back in August 1936, it genuinely looked like a step into the modern world. When the first batch arrived in May 1937, there was real optimism behind those steel hulls. And by 1939, all 126 tanks were sitting in Romanian hands, lined up as the backbone of an armored future that hadn't yet met reality. At its heart sat a 37mm Škoda A3 cannon, backed by machine guns, respectable numbers on paper, the kind that promised control, confidence, momentum. Early in the war, the R2, Škoda LTVZ-35, actually did what a tank is supposed to do. It pushed forward, supported advances, and acted like the machine it was bought to be. Then the Eastern Front matured. Armor thickened. Guns grew. And suddenly, the R2 wasn't a predator anymore. It was prey. Its role quietly shifted into survival work, supporting infantry, hitting soft targets, delaying pressure, avoiding Soviet armor it couldn't meaningfully hurt. Renault R35. Imagine Romania in late 1939, grabbing anything that could roll and shoot. That's where the R35 walks in. 41 arrived in August and September, straight from France. Then Poland collapsed, and 34 more R35s crossed into Romania, refugees made of rivets and armor. Overnight, the number hit 75, and just like that, this squat French infantry tank became a principal weapon, not because it was exceptional, but because there wasn't anything else in enough quantity. Its armor was thick for its size, stubborn, and hard to crack. Its gun, however, was painfully small for what the war was becoming. After Stalingrad, that weakness stopped being theoretical. Romanian crews were driving tanks that could endure punishment but couldn't answer it. So in early 1943, workshops began a brutal reinvention. The turret stayed. The French steel stayed. But the gun was ripped out and replaced with a captured Soviet 45mm, pulled from wrecked T-26s and BT-7s. The result became the Vânătorul de Cer R35. Tacom T-60. This one doesn't pretend. The Tacom T-60 is Romania admitting in steel that it was outmatched. Built in 1943, it took captured Soviet T-60 light tanks, tore the turrets off, and bolted on a 76.2mm F-22 Model 1936. Gun inside a shielded fighting compartment. No elegance, no illusion, just function. Depending on the source, 34 were completed, some records pushing the figure higher toward 51, and they stayed in service from 1943 to 1945. The chassis stayed light, which meant speed and mobility survived the surgery. Protection didn't. And that was the point. The Tacom T-60 lived by a glass cannon mentality. It wasn't built to trade blows. It was built to appear, fire first, and vanish before return fire could finish the conversation. Romania didn't have the industry to field purpose-built tank destroyers at scale, so it built them out of battlefield leftovers. These vehicles became the Army's anti-tank punctuation marks, ambush weapons meant to make Soviet armor hesitate, reroute, slow down. WWII AWS. G. There's a moment in every struggling army's history when something truly dangerous finally arrives, and the question becomes whether it's already too late. For Romania, that moment came in autumn 1943, when 100 WWII AOSFG TA assault guns rolled into service, designated locally as TA. Low, tight to the ground, and built for killing tanks from concealment, the WWII wasn't a flashy solution. It was a defensive one. Exactly the kind of machine suited for a force increasingly tasked with holding lines, plugging gaps, and slowing disasters instead of winning races. These vehicles finally gave Romanian units a tool that could genuinely threaten modern enemy armor in a straight fight. And they were used hard. By February 1945, only 13 were still operational, serving with the 2nd Armored Regiment. That number alone tells a story. Even when Romania received a weapon that could stand toe-to-toe with what was coming, it entered a war already grinding everything down to fragments. TACOM R2. The TACOM R2 begins where optimism ends. By 1944, the original R2 light tank was no longer a winning machine, so Romania stopped pretending it was one. Turrets were removed, hulls were stripped, and onto that aging chassis went a 76.2mm ZIS-3 gun, transforming a former frontline tank into a mobile anti-tank platform. The result was produced in stark numbers, 20 vehicles plus 1 prototype, completed in 1944, serving into 1945. On paper, it looked like evolution. In reality, it was triage. Armor stayed thin. Silhouettes stayed tall. But the gun finally gave crews a chance to kill what was hunting them. The TACOM R2 was battlefield relevant because it changed the question from, "Can we survive this encounter?" to, "Can we end it quickly?" It worked best when used the hard way. Ambush positions, short exposure, fast relocation, no second chances. Romania was watching its armored fleet age in real time, and instead of discarding it, they cut it apart and rebuilt it into something that might still matter. A Panzer IV. Let me talk honestly about this tank because when the Panzer IV finally entered Romanian service, it didn't arrive like a hero. It arrived like a late doctor in a burning hospital. Across the war, Romania received roughly 120 Panzer IVs, spread across different models, dripped in over time rather than delivered as a single decisive force. And yet, inside Romanian armored units, this machine immediately stood apart. Unlike the R2s, the conversions, or the captured patchwork fleet, the T4 was one of the very few vehicles Romania operated that was designed from the start to fight modern tanks, not merely survive around them. Crews trusted it in ways they couldn't trust most of what they drove. But that trust lived inside a collapsing strategic picture. By the time Panzer IVs were appearing in meaningful numbers, Romania wasn't shaping the battlefield anymore. It was reacting to it. These tanks didn't reverse momentum. They were fed into fires already burning. R1. This one never pretended to be a tank. The R1, Skoda AH4, was built to move, to look, to whisper information back to units that needed eyes more than armor. Romania used it exactly that way. Cavalry reconnaissance, screening, liaison work. The kind of missions that sound light until you realize they're performed in front of everyone else. It carried only machine guns. Its armor was extremely thin, the sort that stops wind and very little else. And yet, when the Eastern Front erupted in 1941, these tiny vehicles were pushed forward anyway. Not because they belonged there, but because something had to go first. Early in the campaign, R-1 crews became Romania's fast eyes, slipping ahead of columns, mapping danger, reporting movement. Then Soviet armor entered the picture in force. From that moment on, the R-1's job quietly shifted from observation to evasion. Crews learned that survival lived in speed, not steel. From 1941 to 1943, they were still present, still rolling, but their relevance thinned as the war mechanized beyond them. The R-1 didn't vanish in an explosion. It faded. All right, now let me show you something completely different. That is, Soviet. T-38 amphibious tank. Some vehicles feel like they wandered into the wrong war. The T-38 is one of them. Romania didn't build it. Romania didn't order it. Romania found it. By November 1st, 1942, Romanian forces had captured 3 T-38 amphibious tanks. Then, in March 1944, 4 more appeared in their inventory. That's it. 7 small, floating machines pulled out of a battlefield that had no patience for what they were. The T-38 was a 2-man amphibious scout tank, built to slide through water and marshland, not trade fire. Its armor was painfully thin. Its only weapon was a 7.62 millimeter machine gun. In Romanian hands, its purpose was obvious: river crossings, ditch navigation, localized scouting, and rear area escort work. It made sense there. It did not make sense under artillery skies, which is exactly why its presence matters. Captured Soviet. T-28. The T-28 looks like something from another era because it is. Long, bulky, multi-turreted, and mechanically demanding, it belonged to a pre-war vision of armored warfare that the Eastern Front had already buried. And yet, by the 1st of November 1942, Romania had 2 captured T-28 medium tanks listed in its inventory. Only 2. But their existence speaks louder than their number. By 1942, this machine was already out of step with reality. Too large, too complex, too outdated for a battlefield ruled by speed, radios, and concentrated firepower. Romania still kept them, not as breakthrough weapons, but as local fire support platforms, as intimidation tools, as steel strongpoints meant to sit, speak loudly, and refuse to move easily. Their role leaned toward holding ground, not taking it. And every kilometer they traveled carried hidden costs, incompatible parts, mismatched ammunition, mechanics forced into invention rather than maintenance. T-60, the T-60's Romanian story, doesn't start as a weapon. It starts as material. Romania is clearly documented as operating captured Soviet light tanks, including the T-60, with figures often summarized as 30 or more. Some were used simply because they ran. In that role, they handled scouting duties and local security, filling gaps wherever something armored was better than nothing at all. But the T-60's real importance sits elsewhere. Romanian engineers didn't see a finished machine. They saw a foundation. These hulls became the basis for Romania's home-built anti-tank solutions, stripped, reshaped, and reimagined when imports slowed, and domestic production couldn't fill the void. In other words, the T-60 became the beginning of something else. It's the clearest mechanical expression of your intro. Vehicles altered under pressure, repurposed because waiting for ideal equipment meant waiting to die. Na carul de luptă. Tipultray funny thing about the T3 in Romanian service, nobody treated it like a miracle. It showed up quietly, folded into a shipment that arrived in October 1942 when Germany sent 11 Panzer III AUSF N tanks, along with 11 Panzer IV AUSF. Geez. On Romanian paperwork, it became Carul de Luptă Tipultray, T3, but on the battlefield, its personality mattered more than its name. The AUSF N wasn't built to duel modern tanks. Its short-barreled 75mm gun was tuned for infantry positions and fortifications, a bruiser rather than a sniper. And yet, during the disaster unfolding around Stalingrad, something telling happened. Inside the 1st Armored Division, the T3 and T4 companies were the ones that actually stayed effective, especially when compared to older Romanian types that were being chewed apart. That effectiveness didn't mean dominance. It meant they could still function. They could still move, fire, support, and respond. Maréchal. If there's one vehicle on this list that feels like a thought racing a bullet, it's the Maréchal. Long before it had a finished shape, Romanian leadership had already decided something radical. Waiting on foreign deliveries wasn't a survival anymore. Development began in 1942, with the prototypes emerging in 1943, all aimed at creating a local answer to Soviet armor. The earliest versions leaned heavily on captured T-60 components, because that's what workshops had. But the project didn't stay stitched together from trophies. Later prototypes pushed toward a more Romanian-built design, centered around the powerful 75mm Reșița Model 1943 anti-tank gun. On paper, it was everything Romania needed: low profile, lethal, purpose-built. In reality, the calendar was the enemy. By 1944, the Maréchal existed mainly in testing grounds and crew training, not in massed frontline units. Bombing, supply collapse, and political upheaval crushed any hope of real production. Renault FT-17. Romania had scores of Renault FT-7s on its rolls when the Second Global War began, relics kept alive through the interwar years because replacement never truly arrived. The FT-17 had once been revolutionary. Rear engine, front hull machine gun, a fully rotating turret. The layout every modern tank would later copy. Romania adopted it early, trained on it, and organized around it. But by the 1940s, that old brilliance had thinned into fragility. Its armor was too thin, its weapons too weak, or its presence too vulnerable for modern fronts. So these machines were pulled away from the storms. They moved into base defense, rear security, and training roles, never committing to major frontline battles. And yet, they never disappeared. They stayed on strength. They were counted, maintained, and issued where they could be. That persistence tells its own story. Tokam R2. The Tokam R2 didn't emerge from a design office. It emerged from a problem. By late 1943, work had begun on turning the outdated R2 light tank into something that could still matter. The solution was blunt and effective. Remove the turret, carve a fixed, partially roofed fighting compartment, and install a captured 76.2mm ZIS-3 field gun. By mid-1944, the count stood at 20 completed vehicles and 1 prototype. The finished machine weighed about 12 tons. I carried roughly 30 rounds for its main gun, mounted 1 hull machine gun, and ran with a 3-man crew inside 10 to 17 millimeters of armor. It wasn't built to absorb punishment. It was built to strike first. These vehicles were assigned to tank destroyer units in 1944 to 45, fighting in Transylvania and Czechoslovakia as part of improvised armored groupings after Romania changed sides. Against lighter armor, the Takam R2 could be genuinely dangerous. Against heavy Soviet tanks, it was still outclassed. Armored cars and reconnaissance AFVs. Let's step away from tanks for a moment, because Romanian armored warfare didn't live on tracks alone. Alongside its tank units ran a wide mix of armored cars and reconnaissance vehicles, including Škoda Verzon 25 and Verzet 27, various Tatra designs, and captured Soviet types like the BA-10 and BA-64. In total, on around 200 armored cars served during the war. They weren't there to punch holes through heavy armor. They were there to find routes, screen movements, carry messages, protect convoys, and delay advances when heavier forces weren't available. And often, they weren't. These vehicles became the connective tissue of Romanian operations, especially during retreats, chaotic redeployments, and defensive scrambling. When tank units faltered or were outnumbered, armored cars filled the spaces in between, probing, stalling, reporting, buying minutes that sometimes meant lives. Thanks for being with us. Hope you liked today's listing. Don't forget to press the like and subscribe button for future updates.